Questions. Over the past few weeks, our Democratic colleagues have suggested the following. After the initial release of the GDP report, the president is driving the economy into a recession. Chairman Powell, the latest FOMC statement described economic activity had to continue to expand at a solid pace, and you just reiterated that in your testimony this morning. In your view, is the term recession and the economy growing at a solid pace, are those synonymous with each other?
I would say no.
And you note that the labor market continues strong, the economy's at a standard pace, and you also referenced in your testimony that first quarter GDP initial react was also from front-end loading, as you noted, imports to try to avoid tariff impacts. Also, I looked at the Atlanta Fed GDP Now model, which forecasts GDP growth for the second quarter of this year at nearly 4%, with core GDP forecast at 2%. Does that Atlanta model suggest a recession to you?
No, I would say it doesn't.
So in looking at your remarks about tariffs today and then the ones that you made during March and April, I was looking back at a Fed study that noted that up until March, tariffs have already been partially passed through in consumer prices, leading to a contribution of merely 1/10 percentage point increase in core PCE prices. And a Harvard study last week showed that prices have only modestly adjusted since the announcement of tariffs. Finally, the longer-term inflation expectations remain consistent with the 2% goal. Governor Waller laid out a pathway that allows for rate cuts provided that average effective tariff rates remain close to 10%, or I assume he means 10% or lower. The labor market remains solid. Prices continue to disinflate. So given that data I've outlined, I'm sure data that you're very familiar with, for the economy to avoid persistent inflation, do you concur with Governor Waller that there is a pathway for good news as it relates to the regulatory policies, the tax policies that I've discussed, in a world with lower tariff rates?
So first, I wouldn't comment on any other FOMC members' comments one way or the other, but I will say this. I think many paths are possible here, and certainly the one you mentioned is a possible one. We could see inflation come in not as strong as we expect, and if that were the case, that would tend to suggest cutting sooner. We could see the labor market weakening, and that would also suggest cutting sooner. On the other hand, if we see inflation coming in higher, or if the labor market were to remain strong, then we would probably be moving later. So I think a range of possible paths are possible, and certainly the one you mentioned is one of them.
In February of 2021, you told us in this committee that you would stay in your lane and not comment on President Biden's proposal for the American Rescue Plan or sharply increasing federal spending. And you said it was an issue, but that you would stay in your lane and not comment on it. But here in this year, you have commented on this idea of tariffs being set by the executive branch. So are tariffs in your lane, but a huge fiscal spending by the Biden administration not in your lane? Explain to the committee why you chose to be silent in February of 21, but outspoken this spring.
Sure. So we haven't commented, and it would be inappropriate for us to comment on the policy of tariffs. We don't have a view. It's not our job, and we just wouldn't do that. And just as we wouldn't comment on the reconciliation package that you're working on right now. We're not commenting on tariffs. What our job is inflation, keeping inflation under control, and also keeping maximum employment. And when policies have what appear to be short and medium-term implications, meaningful implications for that, then they kind of, not the policies themselves, but the inflation becomes our job.
Yeah. My views on price stability. I think it's a first among equals in your dual mandate. I've argued for that. I've introduced legislation to make the dual mandate the sole mandate, and we've talked about that before. But I was very curious about your thoughts on former president of the Cleveland Bank, Loretta Mester's quote that I read from last fall. She says, "I think that maximum employment is the maximum level of employment consistent with price stability." In other words, she elegantly ties that together, that price stability is what you can have more control over rather than all these other factors that enter the employment picture, like legislative and executive branch. What's your thought about her quote?
I personally think that's a very reasonable way to think about it.
Thank you very much. I yield back. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.